The Hungarians, who already ruled Croatia, the city of Belgrade and its surroundings, and the future Banat of Temesvar, had managed to cross the Carpathians into modern Oltenia during the last quarter of the 13th century and establish a march or buffer province called the Banat of Severin, in which a Hungarian ban ruled over several Romanian voivodeships, some of which were transalpine, that is, partly in Oltenia and partly in present-day Hatseg region across the Carpathians. A document of exceptional importance allows us to form an idea of the political and social situation in those regions around the time of the Mongol invasion. It is the charter that King Bela IV of Hungary granted in 1247 to the Knights Hospitaller, also known as the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, or in Romanian, Cavalerii Ioaniți, in order to settle the Banat of Severin, to colonize and defend it as vassals of the King of Hungary. The document is known to history as the Charter of Hospitallers. Let us talk about this document for a moment, because it provides us with a sort of snapshot of this region just a few decades before the dismounting of the voivodeship of Wallachia, the traditional term used for the establishment of the two Romanian medieval states. But first, who were the Knights Hospitaller? Soon after the First Crusade, at the end of the 11th century, a religious and military order was formed in the new Christian kingdom of Jerusalem, warrior monks whose mission was to care for the wounded and always be ready to take up arms against the heathens or non-believers, meaning the Muslims. It was called the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, and initially the majority of its members were Frenchmen. More orders will appear later, of which it is important to remember the Knights Templar, who will become the great bankers of Western Europe, and the Teutonic Knights, who, after leaving Palestine and a brief presence in southeastern Transylvania, in Romanian, Țara Bârsei, will colonize northern Poland and create a large enclave around the port of Danzig, or in Polish today named Gdansk, called East Prussia, which the Germans will rule until the German disaster of World War II. After the expulsion from Palestine at the end of the 13th century, the Hospitallers settled in Cyprus, then on the island of Rhodes, and finally pushed out by the Ottoman Turks on the island of Malta. Since then, they were known as the Knights of Malta. In 1247, 6 years after the catastrophic Mongol invasion, King Bela IV of Hungary made a deal with the Grand Master of the Hospitallers, bestowing onto the order the Banat of Severin, that is, Oltenia, and a small part of present-day Banat, to defend as vassals. The contract they drew up on this occasion reveals some extremely interesting details that helps us put together a picture of this part of our country about half a century prior to the establishment of a state comparable in size to the great duchies of the feudal age, which will be called Wallachia, or in Romanian, Țara Românească. It is surprising to discover the number of knights who were supposed to arrive, just a few dozen. Let us not forget that, at the time, Western knights, wearing armor as heavy as they were, riding the largest war horses in Europe, also covered in mail, each accompanied by about 10 squires, were the equivalent of today's tanks in the tactics of their age. Moreover, the crusading knights from Palestine had established a reputation as the world's best fortification builders. That is precisely what the King of Hungary was expecting from them, as well as organizing colonization, on condition they would not accept any settlers from Transylvania, proof that people had begun to seep out from Transylvania towards the plains of the south and east even before the drafting of the charter. Here is some of the information revealed in the charter. We learn about the existence of a Romanian voivodeship ruled by a certain Litovoi, to which the king had granted special status within the province, and which extended across the Carpathians into Hatseg, an area that the king did not include in the territory given to the order. Two kniazes, Ioan and Farkas, are also mentioned. The name Ioan is spelled the way Romanians would pronounce it, and not as Johann, as German would, or János, as Hungarians would, or even as Slavics would, Jovan. Farkas means wolf in Hungarian, so the Hungarians claim that he might have been a Magyar chieftain. More likely he was a Romanian kniaz who had come south from Transylvania, where his name, or that of his ancestors, had been changed from Lupu in Romanian or Vâlcu in Slavic to Farkas. Litovoi is a Slavic name. Interestingly, 25 years later, Another Litovoi, or perhaps the same, from the same area, rebels against the Hungarian suzerain and dies in the battle. He is succeeded by a brother of his called Barbat, a decidedly Romanian name. The order was encouraged to claim land beyond the former Cumania, where the king granted special status to another voivodeship, that of Seneslav, probably situated in the Argeș region. This name is Slavo-Romanian, perhaps deformed by the Hungarian chancellery. Could he have been the Vlach lord that resisted the southern prong of the Mongol attack in 1241? From the financial clauses of the charter, it can be inferred that tithes and taxes were being levied on harvest and fishing in the march, and therefore that an organized peasantry and economy were in place, even if somewhat dispersed. The country was nevertheless sufficiently populated to have its own levy, which the order had to raise in aid of the king should he have been at war with his neighbors. Finally, the charter reveals that alongside the voivodes and knyazes mentioned by name, there were other two lords of the land, to whom the king granted substantial privileges, such as the right to appeal to the king's court in case they disputed the verdict of his vassal, the Grand Master of the Order, and were allowed death by beheading if found guilty. It follows that these lords made up a rather important local power, enough for the king to take them under his protection in some circumstances, extending his jurisdiction from 1,000 kilometers away. So the country must have had political and military leaders from before that time. They were the future boyars we will find around the voivode a few decades later. When the Mongol wave was approaching, their leader requested safe passage over the Carpathians and shelter for his people from the king of Hungary. The king settled them along the valley of Tisa, where they would cause much trouble to royal officials for generations to come. Moreover, the king married a Cuman princess. Cuman women were famous for their beauty, and such noble unions had been made with Russian knyazes and even with Byzantium imperial family. And it was from this marriage that the last king of the Arpadian dynasty would be born, Ladislao IV, or Laszlo, nicknamed the Cuman because of his love for his maternal heritage. He would adopt Cuman dress and hairstyle to the dismay of his Hungarian subjects. And so again I wonder, could all these Cumans have fled from our country at the time? There are many signs that this was not the case. Later Hungarian documents from Transylvania tell of the presence of some Cumans in the province around the 14th century, and there are a great deal of Cuman names in the region of Făgăraș and Hațeg, as well as toponyms in Wallachia, secluded places high up in the mountains, very typical of our ancestral traditions, such as Loviște. It is not a trivial matter that in the early Wallachian documents of the 14th and 15th century we find a fairly large proportion of Cuman names among the country's boyars, which does not necessarily mean they were all of Cuman descent, but shows how profound the Cuman influence had been.